Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Michael Saikuda, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this program hosted by the Financial Research Institute at the University of Missouri. FRI's mission is to facilitate effective, productive regulatory policy for public utilities by providing a neutral forum for stakeholders to come together to examine, understand, and debate current issues relating to public utility policy. We also conduct educational and research programs to better equip industry decision makers and decision making. Today's discussion will be focused on resource adequacy, planning, and retention. In recent years, load responsible entities and balancing authorities have had to consider a dizzying array of new variables as they work to achieve their goal of keeping the lights on for their customers. As the world transitions away from conventional thermal generation units, which are retiring due to market forces, age, and wear, and we see an increase in variable renewable resource penetration in the form of wind and solar generation, the grid operators and those with balancing authority responsibilities have found themselves searching for new solutions to keep the system in balance. This search for solutions, led by the LREs and VAs, is occurring against the backdrop of increasing frequency and severity of weather-related emergencies, the slow pace of development for commercially reliable ESR technology, and perhaps most concerning, the fact that our resources are all connected to a transmission system designed to facilitate the generation fleet and load patterns of yesterday, trying to meet the challenges of today. In the meantime, it's incumbent on all of us in industry, consumer advocates, and regulators to plan for the challenges of tomorrow. The panel discussion about to get underway is focused on precisely this issue. I'll introduce our moderator in just a moment, but before I do, I want to mention that FRI will be hosting a half-day virtual seminar on November 8th, focused on planning efforts to enhance and modernize transmission systems. I'll post a link to that seminar, that workshop, in the chat as later in the webinar today, so you can register. The seminar, Making the Grade, Developing an Actionable Response to Improving Electricity Transmission, will take an in-depth look at the Transmission Planning Development Regional Report Card recently issued by the Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. Additionally, it will feature discussion from industry executives and state regulators to try and get past the usual talking points and get to actionable ideas to move the problem forward. For today's panel, our moderator is Patrick Woods, Director of Business Affairs for ITC Great Plains. He serves as co-chair of the Hot Topic Hotline Committee and was recently elected vice chair for the FRI Advisory Board. Patrick, we're glad to have you doing this. Thank you, and I'll turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saikuda. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to introduce our panelists and jump right into this conversation. So, joining us today is Commissioner Julie Fedorchak of the North Dakota Public Service Commission, Ms. Marie Berninger, the Director of Business Development for Con Edison Transmission, Mr. Miles Keogh, the Executive Director of the National Association of Clean Air Agencies, and Mr. Matthew Rice, the Director of Indiana Electric Regulatory and Rates for CenterPoint Energy. Welcome, everybody. What we're going to do is we are going to open up. I'd like to offer each of our guests an opportunity to make opening comments on the topics that are to be addressed in this discussion today. And I'm going to ask them that they make opening comments that address their respective organization's view of the resource adequacy challenges facing us today, and talk about what actions they're taking to address these challenges. So I'd ask that each panelist limit their statements to 2 minutes each, and let's go. I think we're going to start with Ms. Marie Berninger. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Patrick, and for facilitating this conversation today. And thank you all for inviting me to this. Just a little bit of my background for the context of my opening comments. My current role is in transmission development in multiple organized markets, but I've spent most of my career at a regulated utility in New York, working on both engineering and wholesale markets. And when I think about resource adequacy, I think the basis for any change or evolution needs to be, the basis assumption needs to be maintaining or improving the current reliability standards as a top priority, because without that, we risk losing buy-in for clean energy policies that we're trying to achieve. So that said, I think how we approach achieving or exceeding reliability standards as the resource landscape changes can be approached in new ways. So our thinking about how to achieve resource adequacy, incorporating new technologies such as large-scale storage, distributed energy resources, needs to evolve. We need to approach that evolution with broad stakeholder involvement and a balance of innovation and an innovative approach and conservative planning based on experience. Because the ultimate goal is, of course, to provide reliable, essential service at a reasonable cost. Across the country, we're starting to get more and more of new resources incorporated into the grid, and the question of resource adequacy and reliability becomes a lot more complex as we achieve the very high levels of renewable penetration, which we really haven't gotten there yet. So, for example, in New York, we have a legislative mandate for 70% renewables by 2030. And I think operating a system that's 70% renewables is going to be a whole new paradigm. We're going to have to think about operating reserves, frequency response in that context, and also the overall operation of a system that has a high penetration of inverter-based resources, which is very different. And so I think there needs to be an awareness of these critical technical issues at a policy level, and encouragement to expeditiously work through them well in advance of us getting there, and a lot of coordination between reliability organizations, RTOs, transmission owners. Of course, a very important and near and dear to my heart is transmission is a very important tool that should be thought of in the context of multi-values, which I'm sure we'll talk more about. And this is indeed how it's being approached in many regions. Because transmission adds operational flexibility and reliability and relieves local constraints. And those local constraints can really elevate the cost of meeting resource adequacy. So in the long run, transmission is essential to achieving a cost-effective approach as our system evolves. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think next we will go to Commissioner Julie Fedorchak.
Good afternoon or good morning, whatever time zone you're in. Thank you, Patrick. And thank you to FRI and the University of Missouri for sponsoring this event and on such a really important topic. I agree with a lot of what Marie said. So from my perspective, we're at a real risk. I think we've seen this from a number of different entities who have evaluated the risk nationwide of not having enough capacity resources, that is generators that you can turn on, especially when you look at the dependence that we have with the new resources on weather and the inherent unpredictability of the weather and whether those resources will be available or not. And then we also at the same time have growing demand, the likelihood of growing demand. And I think we can count on that with increased use of electric vehicles and other ways of electrification. So the real challenge I think right now is that retirements are happening faster than replacement generation that has the same characteristics in terms of keeping the grid reliable. The retirements are happening faster than those new resources are coming online and being available. So I really appreciate in the title of today's conversation, the retention piece, because I think that's one of the focuses that we need to look at is our retention. So a number of the things that I think need to happen and are happening, but need to happen faster. We need to realign the planning processes that we all use to account for the different operational characteristics of the new resources and really be careful about what we're counting on the new resources to do in terms of what they're replacing and when they're going to be available. We also need to adjust the market structures to make sure that the markets are sending the right signals to secure those capacity resources, bring them online, and to pay the ones that are already online fairly for what they're providing to the grid and to reliability. We need to work with EPA on some of their new regulations and the timelines established there. Some of the regulatory burdens that the EPA is proposing for the fossil generations going to exacerbate our already really dangerously tight capacity situation in this country, and we need to make sure that we're being realistic about the timeframes by which we can accomplish some of those regulatory goals as well. And then finally, I'd say that we need to explore a variety of ways to decarbonization. I feel like I've been in this industry now for 10 years as a regulator, and I feel like there's a lot of momentum around the solar wind battery transmission approach. And that might be the best approach, but it might not be the best approach. And I think we still need to be really open and to looking at some of the cost benefits and opportunities of some other approaches to decarbonization, the advanced nuclear, carbon capture and storage, and some of those other avenues that might allow us to use some of the existing system better that already is there, not require as much build out. North Dakota is an energy producing state, and even in my state, people are weary of new projects and siting and construction. So I have really significant concerns about just the ability and the appetite of the American public to have all this new infrastructure constructed in their backyard. So I think we just need to be really open to a wide variety of new technologies and new opportunities for getting us to the same path of decarbonization. And I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Fedorchak. Thank you. Very interesting. Now we turn to Mr. Matt Rice of CenterPoint Energy.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Also, thank you to FRI for giving us this platform to talk through these issues. So I work for CenterPoint Energy. I'm in the Indiana electric jurisdiction. So that's Southern Indiana, the old Keogh or Vectren electric territory. We've got about 150,000 customers and about 1,300 megawatts of generation. So like other utilities in the Midwest, we've been working through a generation transition. Ours is coming on us very quickly. In a couple of weeks, we're going to close 2 of our coal plants due to EPA regulations that are coming through that would have required very costly upgrades. Our plan, just for context, it moves towards renewables, but backed up by dispatchable resources. And so we've been paying very, very close attention to resource adequacy within MISO, all those conversations that have been ongoing for a good while. So I just, when you hear me talk about a plan, I'm coming from a gen planning perspective, but we also incorporate our T&D folks in our team. So it is very much a company-wide effort to figure out how to move forward. Any solution that a company's thinking about has to be affordable, has to be reliable. Those are just kind of bedrock things. But you have to also be able to adapt to changing conditions. If I've seen anything doing resource planning for the last 12, 14 years, it's that you can't really predict the future. You can have a good idea of where it's going, but you have to understand where the boundary conditions are and plan for those things and figure out where your off ramps are in case you have to pivot. I can tell you that we also at CenterPoint, we look at a wide range of resources. So we're not just thinking about supply side resources, but also demand side resources. And we have to have resources that can turn on quickly, ramp fast, and back these renewables. So you'll hear that in the context of my comments today too.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Rice. And now, last but not least, I would like to turn to Mr. Miles Keogh of the National Association of Clean Air Agencies. Mr. Keogh.
Hey, y'all. Thanks for having me on board. It's really such a pleasure and an honor to get to do work with these smart people. And when I was invited to do this, I was just high-fiving myself that I would get to speak electric power stuff a little more. My name is Miles Keogh. Now I get the corner office at the National Association of Clean Air Agencies, which convenes the state and local agencies that implement the Clean Air Act. But prior to this, I spent about a decade ago, I spent a bunch of time working with and for the public utility commissioners and helped set up the Eastern Interconnection States Planning Council. And I'm a transmission hugger of note. So I really am glad to get a chance to talk about this stuff with y'all. So when clean air people, when you ask them about resource adequacy, that's not a term that's in their technical vernacular or in their regular vernacular either. It's something that exists outside of the kinds of considerations that they're bringing to the table as we put together this sort of team of rivals approach where folks are trying to balance different kinds of priorities and concerns. I know that there are some situations with the reserve margins that are out there that are tight. ERCOT looks like really worryingly tight. MISO in California look really tight, but it's not tight everywhere. In the Southeast, you've got 36 to 38% reserve margins. SPP's in the neighborhood of 23. New York, New England, they're both north of 25. PJM's 34%. So, you know, like there are concerns and we need to be careful and we need to plan, but it's not everywhere, everything all at once. What, from my perspective, we want to think about is what's changing. Like, how do we solve the problems that we have now? But more importantly, how do we, in the great words of Wayne Gretzky, skate to where the puck is going to be? And so for how I'm thinking about it as an air person, as a climate person, is what are the factors that are changing? And where do we need to skate fastest to make sure that we don't create reliability problems as we solve all the other very towering challenges that we need to solve at the same time? One thing that I think is sort of a high class problem is if things go right, load's going to go up. It'll be cleaner, but load will increase. We'll have electrification of vehicles and buildings and industry and lots of other stuff. And that should create higher load, right? And at the same time, we're going to need to deal with changing weather. I don't know if y'all have been paying attention to the news, but I was walking around in almost knee-deep water in New York City over the weekend. And the weather is going to get crazier, and that is going to get more challenging for our load-serving entities to deal with and address. We got to solve both those problems at the same time. And we got to keep those weather problems from getting worse. The climate crisis is for real. And I know everybody on here agrees with me that it needs to be taken seriously and that we got to do something about it. And we're just here to talk through and figure out, like, what is that pathway? What's the pathway that gives us the most wins with the least losses? We also have a ton of areas that are moving further and further into non-attainment, into non-compliance with the law, with the Clean Air Act, with greater exposure for our citizens to air that makes them sick and makes them die earlier. And we do need to put that on at least an equal footing with reliability and affordability. And so that means we got a lot of spinning plates. We got to solve a lot of problems all at once. A number of EPA rules are going to drive changes. There's the good neighbor rules for upwind and downwind states. There's the replacement for the next step in the MATS, the mercury and air toxics rules. There's obviously the power plant GHG rule. There's all these other rules where we're all trying to look at this and say, and among all these problems that we've got to solve, how do we solve all these problems at once and resolve the issues where we've got urgent crises now, rather than trying to figure out like the do we, don't we question. One thing I'm really heartened by from economic regulators and from utility folks, from transmission owners, is we're really much more in the space now where we're talking about how do we do this gracefully? How do we do this skillfully? Where do we need help? What flexibilities create the opportunities to get the wins we need to get and to minimize the number of trade-offs that we need to do that? And I'm confident because utilities have met all the previous challenges. Acid rain program came in under budget, ahead of schedule. The MATS program compliance was under budget, ahead of schedule. The Clean Power Plan never even came into effect, and utilities met that under budget and ahead of schedule. It's like you give these engineers a problem and they can come through and find it, find the solution, all cheaper, earlier than planned, with no reliability issues. Again, I'm coming to the table here as the enviro, as the person who's looking at how do we stay in compliance with the law, with the Clean Air Act? How do we address the climate crisis? How do we grow load and drive prosperity and take as few challenges on with that as possible? And I think the way that we do that is we expand my vernacular to understand resource adequacy better. We expand your vocabulary to understand the issues confronting the air world geeks and the climate world geeks like me better. I'm really excited for today's conversation where we, continue those conversations, which are really the key to solving this thing.
Thank you, Miles. Thank you. So I tell you what, after hearing all of the introductions of all of the panelists, I'm even more excited about this conversation today because I think we hit just about every single major issue that faces us when it comes to resource adequacy planning and retention. So to set this conversation up, I want to go directly kind of to the heart of the issue and the big issue that's hanging out there in front of us. And all of our panelists in their intros have hinted, pointed toward this issue. But the clean energy transition, which we heard Dr. Saikuda mention in his intro, Marie actually pointed directly to this in her intro. It comes with all kinds of benefits, we know. Lower adjusted production costs, lower marginal fuel costs for customers, emissions reductions that Miles just mentioned, the new economic development opportunities driven by technological advancements in many rural communities, really important things that we all want. However, I think we know that harnessing the transition and making the most of it for our customers comes with some new challenges. And that's what I want to start this conversation off talking about. Some of the challenges, are the fact that traditional generation will be replaced by more variable generation, or at least that's what's happening now, as Commissioner Fedorchak mentioned. In the 3 RTOs that are closest to FRI, where we sit right now, forecasts show potential losses of coal and gas-fired generation, the traditional sources, to the tune of 40 gigawatts in PJM, 9 gigawatts in MISO, and 8 gigawatts in SPP. So I want to first of all deal with this issue here of the transition, and I want to toss the first question out to Matt because he is sitting in a spot where he is right now, as he mentioned, developing a resource plan and having to deal with some of these issues. What needs to happen to ensure that the transition progresses as intended? I think we all agree that it's a good, positive thing. We want it. But what do we have to do to make sure we get what we want out of this for customers, that we're prepared for this new reality? And how should this affect regional resource planning?
Yeah, I think the big thing is you have to constantly be planning because conditions continually change. You have to be looking to the future to see where you think things are going. And I kind of like that quote that Miles had, you got to skate to the puck. So we do this in Indiana with a broad stakeholder process. So we get multiple voices together. We talk through the plan as we go through it. We try to better understand what their perspective is, and then we try to help them with our perspective and meet somewhere in the middle on a lot of issues as we're going through the plan. Again, affordability is super important, and those 2 coal units that I said they're just getting ready to close. We still had a big net book balance on those plants. And so to work around that and try to help with affordability, we actually went to the state legislature and got a new law passed in Indiana that allowed a pilot for securitization. And customers are already receiving those affordability benefits today. Their bills are lower because we went through that process. So very thankful to the legislature in Indiana for doing that. We, as I mentioned before, your team, when you're doing your planning, don't silo your team. You don't just have Gen people and T&D people. You have to work together. And so they're all on my IRP team. We have DSM experts. We have experts at MISO. They're looking at resource adequacy, where it's going. We have gas supply folks to understand what it takes to have firm supply, to make sure that we can maintain reliability. And then finally, you have to keep your eyes on new technologies. There are lots and lots of news stories about everything that's coming out under the sun. We hear about those things in our stakeholder process and try and stay ahead of it. Some of those are ready for prime time and some aren't. You just have to be realistic about what you're modeling. Don't put things in that aren't real just yet. They may be great in the future, but you have to really understand what those technologies can do, what their capabilities are, what their limitations are. It's very exciting, but you have to be a realist.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I'm going to just toss out there also, if any of the other panelists have anything that they'd like to add or want to respond to any of these statements, please do just, raise your hand, with a little hands up signal, and that way I'll make sure I won't miss you. Marie.
I didn't know where the hand signal was, so I used my real hand, but thank you.
That works. That's perfect.
A lot of what you said, Matt, resonated with me. And I like where you were going with the mention of needing to constantly plan and update and checking in about your assumptions and continuously improving that. And also just a comment on how to tie that to technology, because I think you're right. Some of those technologies and what we're hoping they're capable of doing, we can see how they can contribute to those planning solutions, but they're not ready yet. And it's like a monitoring of the plan and the technology, giving signals to the technology providers of what's needed to mature that, so that in the future, we're expecting and hoping that those technologies do provide that planning resource that we can rely on. And that's going to, and sort of having that foresight for long term is critical. So I appreciated those comments, and that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you. So as a follow-up, I guess I'd ask, and this is to anybody on the panel, as I think about this issue, one of the popular things that we often hear people say is, I endorse an all of the above strategy, that we can only really get to the future by doing, more of everything. So is the solution simply just to build more of everything? And by saying that, what I mean is integrating as many new renewable resources as possible, working to keep dispatchable resources online as long as possible, all while undertaking comprehensive transmission planning to build the transmission platform that allow us to reliably and economically leverage the energy transition to meet our customers' needs, as both Marie and Miles pointed to earlier. Is that really is it that simple? Is that the answer, or what? Disabuse me if I'm wrong about that. Anybody?
So I'll go first, and I like to be a little controversial. I think it's why people keep inviting me to things. It's because I'll say things and then be the villain of the piece. We need to try everything. We have almost run out of runway to deal with the climate crisis, and we really do need to try a lot of different stuff. There are going to be constraints that are technology driven, that are going to be like, this wasn't ready for prime time, and we need to try some of those things anyway. When you look at the auto industry, one of the reasons why Tesla is such a dominant player in the EV business is because the big three automakers kept saying the batteries weren't ready. And in fact, for those folks who are out there driving a Tesla, I think that those big three automakers have been shown to be wrong. We do need to try a lot of stuff, but we can't indefinitely prolong the use of uncontrolled energy sources that continue to add and compound some of the problems that we're trying to solve at the same time. We do need to figure out how we can preserve jobs. Alabama Power was able to shut down its last three coal units with no loss of jobs in Alabama. And we need to figure out how to preserve other kinds of forms of prosperity and deal with the fact that there are communities that have long-standing ties to fossil fuels. We can't just blow that off. That needs to be taken seriously and actually solved, not just lip service. But also, we have about 17 years left to do something very serious, a real revolution in how we make and move and use power. And so we're going to have to try some stuff. We're going to have to take some risks. We're going to have to figure out, are there drop-in fuels like green ammonia or green hydrogen that we can blend with natural gas? we're going to have to look very seriously at questions about how we site and how we construct and finance transmission to connect new resources. We're going to have to try things with demand response that we haven't tried before. When I raised the issue of the Clean Power Plan and MATS and the acid rain program being met ahead of time, under budget, and with no loss, no impacts to reliability. Sorry, I'm holding down a coughing fit. We heard a lot of folks say that it couldn't be done. And my faith is that we're not going to do everything right, but we really are getting closer and closer to a real emergency here. And we need to try some stuff that we haven't done before. Doing the same things that we've done till now is going to keep us headed where we're going.
Thank you, Miles. I want to recognize Commissioner Fedorchak. It seems like good. She had her hand up. I was going to ask you, as somebody who gets to deal with these things as a regulator often,
Yeah.
How are we working right now to try to help shape, this do more of the above? How do we set rules to provide incentive? What's the right answer?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. And Miles, I appreciate your energy and your comments, and I'm going to provide some counter thoughts to what you threw out there. First of all, I would say we are trying a lot of new things. To suggest that we aren't is actually not even close to being remotely true to what's happening today. I mean, we have 35% of the electricity consumed by the citizens in my state is renewable, and that is a significant change over the last 10 years. So let's recognize that and be honest about that. I also think we need to be really honest and clear about the fact that this is a global problem, and the US is most likely positioned to develop the solutions for this global problem, but we can't do that if we undermine ourselves. So we cannot experiment with electric grid. That is the foundation for our entire society. And when things go poorly in the electric grid, people die, and quickly. How many people? 300 to 500 people in Texas were lost because of Storm Uri. And there was something upwards of $300 billion worth of economic damages. And that was just in a matter of a few days. So we have to, I would argue, to be, counter to what Miles said, I would say that one of the most important solutions we have is patience. This is going to take some time. The electric grid is the most complicated machine ever invented by man. And so I think that there's a lot happening. I think we're moving quickly. I think that there's incredibly new opportunities out there. The leaps and bounds, there's changes happening with advanced nuclear that could help provide a lot of reliable, cheap power, not for here only, but for the whole world. And quite honestly, I think that's what we need to be focused on, is finding a way to develop the solution for what we have today, which is reliable, cheap power. That's what we need. And that's what we need to develop, not only for the US, but for the whole globe, so that we can solve this problem comprehensively, and not just pretend that by doing everything here in the US, somehow we're going to solve this problem. Because I'm sure you guys have seen the studies. I know I have. We could shut down all of our fossil fleet and our coal fleet and everything else right now, and we would just have a marginal impact on global temperatures. So we need to be patient and intentional, and make sure that we're doing the right things and coming up with the right technologies so we can be a leader in the world.
Thank you, Commissioner Fedorchak. I think, those are both great points. And while we stated they were counterpoints, they actually somewhat agreed with each other on some instances. I want to move now to another area, I think, which is so very important, and all four of the panelists have hit this in their intros or their comments, subsequent comments, and it is the area of transmission. So, Miles described himself as a transmission hugger, which I really appreciated. I'm going to steal that phrase, by the way, and use it liberally. But, as we mentioned earlier, transmission has a critical part to play in this equation. I think we all know and everybody acknowledges that transmission can alleviate much of the pressure that builds on balancing authorities during these extreme weather events that Commissioner Fedorchak just mentioned, other of the energy emergencies that we've seen recently. Winter Storm Uri, which we just talked about, showed us that transmission that was built primarily for economic purposes, and I'm speaking about the transmission that linked, SPP to MISO to PJM, it yielded extraordinary reliability benefits in the way of interregional transfer capability, which really did save the day in most cases. ERCOT, of course, who suffered during that period, has only 2 DC ties and could only import 800 megawatts from SPP, its neighbor to the north. And while MISO and SPP have 193 tie lines between each other, and SPP was able to import 7,000 megawatts during the storm. These two RTOs had load shed that was limited to a handful of short duration events, while ERCOT, as Commissioner Fedorchak just mentioned, had 4.5 million customers without power, some for 4 consecutive days. And as she mentioned, we're talking about, tragedies in the hundreds when it comes to lives lost and multiple billions of dollars of economic damages. So I want to toss this out first to Marie, because she hit this in her intro, and then to the rest of the panel. How can policymakers send the right incentive signals for investments in transmission, given that it improves all of the other resources performance? What do we need to do here?
Thanks, Patrick. I really appreciate how you queued that up. And I think it speaks to the need to plan transmission investments with multi-values in mind. Because when we think about extreme events and resiliency, we're certainly glad to have made those transmission investments. But of course, in blue sky days and less extreme situations, we're looking at the benefits to outweigh the costs. And so we have to look at all these different values, including meeting to electrification, demand growth, changing landscape of generation. Transmission can be a solution for retirements, of course. Asset condition is critical, and reliability and economics too. And I think that multi-value shift is definitely happening across the country. I think there's also an appreciation that transmission planning in advance and investments are needed to enable public policy, and without it, it can really inhibit it. For instance, we're seeing that on the East Coast with offshore wind, advanced planning of transmission to go offshore to facilitate integration into highly dense urban areas. In many cases, and sort of in this context, I think of transmission as a no regrets approach. And so the more I'd say what we can do from a policy perspective is good, comprehensive, coordinated long-term planning. And that certainly has been an increasing focus in the regions. Creating those opportunities for transmission owners, utilities, and competitive transmission developers to put forth those projects in the regulatory process, both at the state and regional level. So we need the opportunities to do the planning and propose the projects, because the pieces are in place, the incentives are in place. FERC formula rates and state rates work very well as cost recovery mechanisms. And we've done this for decades. We know how to build transmission. They're highly complex projects that need to be planned well in advance. And just to kind of say one more thing about your points about the extreme weather, resiliency is becoming a key part of the dialogue around energy infrastructure investment, really important. And I think on the heels of a major event, resiliency, storm hardening investments to avoid the next major event sort of is ripe to advance that because the vulnerability is so fresh in our minds. but we probably also need to think of a more systematic way to value and plan for resiliency, because more often than not, on blue sky days, it's thrown around, I feel, as an added benefit, but not necessarily leading to design criteria. And depending on the situation, that may or may not be appropriate, but we've got to find balance and the way to make smart investments in resiliency among all those other drivers, and in the context of affordability.
Yeah, so I see we've got Matt's got his hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to add on. I like Marie's comments about long-term transmission planning. In Indiana, we have an incentive to that allows us to recover on transmission distribution projects in our long-term plan as we go. So it kind of limits regulatory lag. It's called TDSIC. And that long-term planning has served us very well. We've got an east-west line that connects our two big plants, one that's going down soon, and that allows for more import capability under our system. And that was a TDSIC project. And additionally, with the supply chain issues, we're seeing substations. It's taken us a few years we have to order them way ahead of time. And so when you have this long-term plan, that allows for you to roll through some of these challenges we have.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And Commissioner Fedorchak.
Sorry, I'm working on my phone and it's very clumsy with, my thing.
I think you're doing just great.
Anyway, so just a couple of quick points on transmission. I often hear transmission being talked about as like one of the near-term solutions. And I get worried when I hear that, because it isn't near term. It takes a long time for these lines to get planned, to get permitted, and to get constructed. So I think, again, like, that's why I hate to be sort of like the wet blanket, but we have to have some patience and realism when it comes to this as well. And then transmission only works when you've got generation on the end of it to connect to. And so again, that takes time as well. So I guess my only point in the whole transmission realm is there's just a lot of excitement on it. I think sometimes it's, we think about that as like, this is going to happen tomorrow and this is going to be the savior. And I just think we need to be realistic in our planning about how long it takes to get these projects done as well. So.
All right, well, I appreciate that point. And, I will say, as the transmission guy, I'm a bit biased, a transmission hugger, as Miles, I stole that already. To your point, though, I do want to ask the question because I think we know that transmission is definitely the most viable long-term solution. In the short term, there is still a lot of work to do. I think it begs the question about comprehensive portfolio style transmission planning. We are starting to see that, people I think are starting to understand that that's probably the best practice when it comes to planning the energy transition that we want to leverage and get the most benefit out of for our customers and to save the day. But, not everybody's been able to muster the forces to actually make those things happen just yet. We look at MISO, where you are a commissioner on the organization of MISO states, you all have made tremendous progress with your long-range transmission plan. I know other regions around the country are looking at you all with green eyes now and wondering how they can figure out how to do this. I want to ask, as we start to think about transmission planning, should we all be doing more, portfolio style transmission planning that takes into consideration cluster studies and the generation that would be attached to it in the future, just as Commissioner Fedorchak just said. Also, we're starting to see HVDC options tossed sometimes into those portfolios as options, which would change our thoughts about, inverter style, inverter-based resources and the way we should be thinking more about spinning reserves and other reliability implications. Let's talk a little bit more about that, issue, and let's hear the panel respond to that.
Patrick, I'll kick it off. I think the answer to your first question about whether we should all be doing comprehensive transmission planning or portfolio transmission planning, I think the answer is yes. We really have to look at all the drivers and what we see coming down the road, and it's got to be comprehensive, and we need to leverage all the values all around. So I think that's absolutely true. And to your point about HVDC connections, it's really interesting. I think that is where we need to look at, because to sort of preface what I was going to say is HVDC doesn't respond as automatically as your AC resources, but it does have a very important value, especially when you're trying to connect resources from a very long distance. It's really the only solution. So where it is, we need to think about, the more DC connected, how do we think about our reliability standards and relying on HVDC technology? Because it's a new paradigm. And if we apply only our conventional planning criteria to it, maybe we're not getting the most value. So can we think about it in a more probabilistic view? And there's a balance here. We've got to think innovatively, but also conservatively. So we make sure that we uphold our reliability standards.
Yeah. And so I noticed Commissioner Fedorchak came off mute a moment ago too, as an OMS commissioner who you may have something to say about this.
Sure. Well, as you alluded to, Patrick, OMS and MISO have been pursuing long-range transmission planning now for probably 4 years, and it is complicated, but it's not impossible. And I think the key that we found was getting everyone in the room, all of the state regulators in particular, and trying to find wins for everybody everyone has different goals and different timelines for meeting them. But if you can find projects that provide enough of a win for everyone, then you can get everyone on board and move forward. And that's certainly what we've got with Tranche 1, which is, about a $12 billion new portfolio of projects. And so now we're working on Tranche 2. Things are a little bit more bumpy on that one, but we'll get through it. I mean, this stuff just is you've got to roll up your sleeves and get to work. And I would say I am a big believer in HVDC. I think if we're going to try to get renewables from the middle part of the country where they're strong to the coasts, that's probably the best solution. And I really like the competitive models. I think that helps. That could make things go a lot faster. If you've got some competitive builders out there who are putting together the users for the project, and you don't have to worry about cost allocation, the costs just get baked into whoever's using the product at the end. I think that should be part of the solution too, and the new innovation that we use in developing the transmission needed for this country. And I will just say back to you, one of your earlier points in kicking off this question, Patrick, you called transmission the solution, and I don't think it is the solution. Maybe you didn't mean it as that. It is a part of the solution, but it is definitely not.
I probably did. I was, it might,
I mean, you
it
are
might have been
husband,
subliminal.
gotta be, realistic.
Thank you. Others, I think I saw, it looked like Miles had a comment.
Nope, I think everybody's been saying it just right.
Okay.
Firm agreement. We gotta, transmission is just one thing that we've got to get better at. This is not a new problem. This is stuff that we've been trying to figure out how to, figure out cost allocation and figure out, integration into long range planning and figuring out these seams issues for forever. In 2012, I wrote a paper for NARUC called Resilience in Regulated Utilities. It was asking these same questions. There's really nothing new under the sun. We've gotten a lot better since 2012, but there's a lot still to do. I forgot the last thing I was going to say, so I'll let us keep going.
Okay. No, that's perfect. You know, I think while I had other questions and other topics to get to, there is so much that I don't think we'll be able to get to anymore. We've had such a great stimulating conversation. I want to make sure we leave some time for Q&A. So the first thing I want to do is let everyone know, if you've got a question, please type them into the chat. There is a Q&A question for now, and I think Dr. Saikuda has it for us.
Sure, Patrick. So Gary Garrett asks, do we see any movement within FERC to move us along more quickly, especially HVDC? And does FERC 2023 do anything for the transmission huggers among us? Not the only, Patrick, you're not the only one taking advantage of that phrase. So what is FERC doing to move this along? Are they doing anything to move this along? Where do they fit into this conversation?
Yeah, so any of the panelists, please feel free to respond.
Someone else wants to go first. I have something else to say about FERC that ties closely to this. Also, hi, Gary. It's great to see you.
I can't call myself a FERC expert. I think good or bad, but I know that they've been focused a lot on this subject, and one area where I have seen some room for improvement would be in how the RTOs in their modeling of their plans, how they're required to or allowed to model the commercial lines. I'm forgetting the word. It's not competitive. What's the word I'm looking for in terms of
merchant? You're thinking of the merchant lines. Yeah. Earlier when you mentioned competitive, we knew you were talking about merchant lines.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate you being able to read my mind. The merchant lines, and they aren't always modeled real effectively in the RTOs when they're looking at their long range transmission planning, which creates an inefficient system. And so I think that there's been some calls out to FERC to look into that and require that. And I think that that's an important piece of this, to make sure that we're looking at all the possible solutions and considering all the data points appropriately, because this stuff, it might be lower cost than other solutions, but it's not exactly cheap, and these costs are going to add up and people are going to feel it. So we need to make sure that we're planning properly and developing an efficient system that doesn't overbuild for what we need.
Thank you.
I just want to kind of do a quick callback to appreciate something that Commissioner Fedorchak said before about how MISO and OMS have really found greater success by bringing a bunch of the folks who have different kinds of ideas and needs and questions, this whole team arrivals approach, putting them at the table. And I think that that's how we're going to get through a lot of this energy transition, is just by, like, we don't actually, like, we sometimes sound like we don't agree, but we actually pretty much all agree. We're trying to do this thing skillfully. And I think that something that's changed, Gary, I'm throwing this to you, something that's changed in the past 10-ish years, 5-ish years, is that FERC's gotten better. And in fact, the power sector community, our family's gotten better at figuring out how to get people to the table. There's still areas where we're not great at it, and there's still areas where the problem seems to be intractable. And siting, I'm looking directly at you. Siting seems to be still something that we just don't know how to get people effectively to the table in a way that produces enough wins for everybody. I still scratch my head thinking about that, and it's not even my job anymore. But on things like trying to figure out how to organize constituencies that are pro-transmission, there's the PSEG group that now is a locus for convening some constituencies of transmission push. There's a stronger kind of constituency for different kinds of voices to come to the planning table. Folks like OMS are coming to the table to do long range planning and thoughtfulness like that. And even FERC's created some better opportunities for folks like clean air and climate folks like myself to come and plug into questions around resource adequacy and the implication of EPA rules. And like, they're having a technical conference on November 9th to explore that exact issue. So, I mean, I know me saying a big piece of the tool, a big effective tool in the toolkit for solving these problems is talking to each other. Kind of sounds like I'm recommending we all go camping or something. I recognize that the challenges are real and technical and hugely economic, but I do think we're doing that part of it much better now, including the FERC, but including the entire kind of power sector family than we'd been doing a decade ago or even 5 years ago. I'm heartened by that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's definitely good perspective, kind of on the evolution and where we've come. I want to ask Marie or Matt if they've got any thoughts on this question. I think this may be the last question that we've got from the panelists.
None from me. Thank you, Patrick.
I would just add a short comment that I think FERC Backstopping Authority is getting some new energy, and I think that it's obvious to many and very important that we de-risk the delivery of these very long lead complex projects because that really undermines what we're trying to achieve when we can't permit and site the transmission, and it is indeed very challenging, and it remains a risk to the projects, and so that's very, worthy of the increased focus it's getting at the federal level, which is great.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. That's an interesting observation on this issue. I have one more question, and since we have 4 minutes, I'll preface. Yes, ma'am.
Could I
Commissioner
just
Fedorchak.
take one other quick little shout out since Miles was generous in his comments to OMS and
Please do.
I do want to, and that we have Matt Rice on the phone on the call from Indiana. One of the key players in the OMS effort on transmission planning and the cost allocation was Commissioner Sarah Freeman from Indiana. And I mean, I just can't say enough about the leadership she brought to that whole process. And so finding people who are gifted like that and bringing them putting them in roles where they can help facilitate is really, really essential to making progress in all of these issues. So I wanted to give her a shout out.
Well, so I always will echo the shout out to Commissioner Freeman. She is our vice chair of the Hot Topics Hotline Committee, not as co-chair, excuse me. She's the leader of our Hot Topics Hotline Committee, and was instrumental in helping to put this together. So I definitely second that shout out. We are about at the end of our time. I think the last thing I will do is call your attention for the viewers and everyone. In the chat, you will see a link that Dr. Saikuda has placed about the upcoming November the 8th transmission seminar. It's a half-day virtual workshop on November the 8th from 12 to 4 Eastern to talk about transmission and grid planning. You can register below at the link there for free. In addition to industry regulator panels, there will be a small group and breakout discussions to identify actionable steps forward, in which we'll have folks from industry, consumer advocates, and regulators. So please tune in for that one. You won't want to miss it. I plan on being there. If you're a transmission hugger like me or not, you see, I'm not letting that go. I'm keeping that. And I'll turn it back over to Dr. Saikuda to wrap us up.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you to all of our panelists. We really appreciate you taking time to be with us today, sharing your expertise and your perspectives. We can't do what we do without the great people in the industry who are willing to share their time and their expertise. And Patrick, for your leadership as one of the co-chairs of the Hot Topics Committee as well, and as our new board vice chair, we appreciate your leadership at FRI. This webinar has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. That's FRI.-Mizzou. We should have that up in the next 24 hours or so. So you can go back and go through this again, share it with others who weren't able to join us. We have another hot topic coming up in December on gas and harmonization, gas and electricity harmonization. We'll be getting details on that out on that soon, as well as that half-day workshop on November 8th. You can learn more about FRI and its programs at fri.missouri.edu, and we hope you'll join us again. Thank you all so much and have a great day.
Thank you.